Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Paweł Lewicki. I'm the Associate Director for the European Studies Center at the University of Pittsburgh. And it is my great pleasure to welcome today Mr. Nicholas Micinski from University of Maine. He is an assistant professor of political science and international affairs at the University of Maine and an author of two books, Delegating Responsibility, International Cooperation on Migration in the European Union, that was published last year at the University of Michigan Press, and UN Global Compacts, Governing Migrants and Refugees, that was published in 2021 with Routledge. Nicholas was postdoctoral fellow at Université Laval, ESA James N. Rosenau, a postdoctoral fellow, and visiting researcher at the Center for the Study of Europe at the Boston University. And the title of his lecture today is EU Migration Governance, Coordination, Collaboration, Subcontracting, and Going Along. Nicholas, thank you for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen, see if I can get that going before we go. Can you see it all right?
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you again for inviting me to speak, and I'm very excited to share this research, which is mostly based on my book. Happy to promote it and also explain some of how it relates to today's politics. So I'm also excited to see the lineup in this interesting series. I mean, lots of great speakers, so I hope to join you later this semester. So thank you again. So you can hear a little bit of my background. I'm an academic. I'm an assistant professor right now at University of Maine. My background, though, is that I was working in NGOs and community development in London with refugees up until 2013. And I started my PhD studying migration governance, thinking broadly about the EU, right as the big influx was happening in Greece and Italy. And so I really wanted to understand what was going on and why the EU was failing to provide much of that protection that was needed. So the project that came out of it, the eventual book, all the fieldwork was all oriented around how to explain what was going on in the EU and how to explain cooperation and failure of cooperation. So today I'm going to talk to you about sort of the way I explain EU cooperation on migration governance and how we might be able to apply it to some of the challenges of today. I want to start off with three snapshots of EU migration governance. First is here in Italy, a picture from 2014, where 600,000 people crossed the Mediterranean from 2014 to 2017, and more than 13,000 people died during that period. The EU responded by opening 4 hotspots to help process and created a new relocation mechanism to spread the burden, spread people around to other member states. However, they only relocated 10,000 of those people. The EU refused to activate the Temporary Protection Directive. The EU also funneled 150 million euros in emergency funding to Italy. 99% of that went to national institutions, but only 0.6% went to international organizations. Overall, it was really a meager response that used coordination among member states to implement a common EU migration policy. A second picture here from Greece. From 2015 to 2016, more than 1.2 million people arrived by land and sea. Right? Similar scenes of agony and distress at the Greek islands. We saw the EU respond with similar hotspots. In the Greek islands, they tried to relocate people, only getting about 20,000 from Greece to other member states. And they dispersed in Greece 700 million euros in emergency aid. But here they actually put 73% of that to international organizations. So nearly 3/4 went to international organizations, and only 23% went to government institutions. Throughout much of Greece, then, UN agencies, rather than government institutions, were responsible for the food, the housing, and relocation of refugees. Because of this, I described the EU response in Greece as subcontracting to international organizations. Now we can look at a third picture. This is from Poland in March 2022, just last year, when refugees from Ukraine began fleeing the Russian invasion, and nearly 8 million Ukrainians have entered Europe since then. The EU responded by activating the Temporary Protection Directive for the first time that allowed freedom of movement within the EU, the right to work, education, housing, and healthcare. This was a blanket decision, and no Ukrainians have to apply for asylum for now. They just get this status and can apply for residency permits. Overall, I would describe this as collaboration because they rely on EU decision-making and joint implementation throughout the process. So let's think about this as a puzzle. Why does the EU respond differently to migration crises in member states in different places? So in Greece and Italy in 2014, 2017, or Poland in 2022 and other states. We can also say, what explains how the EU implements migration governance in different member states? Okay, so my short answer is state capacity and political will. States coordinate when state capacity was high and there were credible partners, but when capacity was low, there were no trusted partners, and they subcontracted to international organizations. But of course, subcontracting is only a short-term fix to a long-term problem. The second short answer for me is that EU migration governance was influenced by repeated policy failure. Right? The EU first tried to coordinate migration policies, but when they failed, and when one partner was revealed to not be credible, the EU tried to collaborate instead. This process of moving from coordination to collaboration, maybe to subcontracting eventually, was influenced by iterative negotiations and policy failures, in addition to historical and political context of each moment. Right? Policy failures provide that information that the EU and other states need about the level of capacity a state has and the credible partners in each country. However, if we compare 2015 to 2022, you can see a stark contradiction. We see geopolitical games and we see racism throughout the EU migration governance. So just a few terms so we get these on the table as well. Migration governance is any formal or informal policy tool aimed at influencing the flow of people across international borders. And I define this a little more specifically in migration management. There are 6 different ways or policy tools, policy goals that you have in migration management. The first being to adjudicate who should enter a country. Second, to stop migrants who should not enter. Third, monitor and regulate migrants who have temporary protection to stay. And fourth, remove migrants who should not have entered, so deportation. And fifth, to deter migrants from ever coming. And sixth, control emigration and diaspora. In all of these areas, there are member state level policies and EU level policies. And in traditional European studies, EU studies, we think of that as the sort of transnational or supranational level. And migration management is not a traditional sphere that the EU would have legal authority over. But we see a gradual shifting over this period that we're studying in the last 30 years of more and more influence in this space. So the other thing I want to point out is that in my study and the way I look at research, there's policy cycles, starting with agenda setting, policy formation, decision-making, then implementation, evaluation. It starts again. And in each one of the migration spheres, we can think about the EU or a member state actively setting the agenda, coming up with ideas. The EU presidency, for example, comes up with a policy proposal, and then actual decision-making in the council and the commission and the parliament, and then implementation. But what I'm looking at is focusing on the implementation sphere. Most studies actually think about the policy formation and decision-making, and that's the grand politics. But we have to look at more closely the decisions of how we implement, right? In what ways are we going to implement migration governance within the EU on the ground at a border? And that's where this study comes in. It's also useful to think about migration state capacity. And I define this as the ability of a state or international organization to effectively allocate resources to achieve the 6 goals of migration management. And this can come in different forms. So think of it as physical resources like drones or databases or fences, and human resources, border guards, asylum officers, different organizations, so the ways in which an agency or the different bodies work together. And fourth, institutions. And I think of those in a political science way, institutions like laws and norms that surround migration state capacity. They can both be restrictive and facilitating migration. Right? It doesn't always have to be about controlling and stopping migration. For example, in Italy in the 1901, they had a commissioner general of emigration, hoping to facilitate emigration mostly to America. You can also see that it changes over time. It's not just one set. It can go up and down. You can build capacity, but also a state can lose capacity at certain points. The second thing I want to put on the table is the idea of credible partners. And this is that the EU needs domestic political leadership that are committed to implementing the policies that are decided at the EU level. Now, that is often hard because there's a moral hazard problem. The idea that domestic political leaders will pursue short-term interests, right? Things that may be hard to defend in domestic elections, that the EU would rather have them make decisions otherwise. We can look at this in several ways. You can see it in public statements by officials and transposing EU directives, their voting records or anti-EU politics, parties, and public opinion. And I look at all of those in my study. Another thing that my book and my project overall did was try to intervene on the idea of what international cooperation meant, right? So this EU member states are working together on some sort of migration policy. Well, that also means that we have to decide very carefully, what does international cooperation mean? Here I broke it into at least 4 different ways. And the key difference here is which actors are implementing the policy. So in coordination, that's when states decide on a common policy and implement it through their own national institutions in their states. So you can see in the diagram, the states go back to their own territories and implement it separately, but it's a common policy. The second area is collaboration, where states decide together that they want a policy, and then they implement it through joint projects or an EU agency. And you can see there, they're working together on the border with a common agency or working together in a space. And a third way is subcontracting. It's when states agree to a policy and then implement it through an external international organization, right? And it's not the EU that they're empowering to do it, but an outside actor, usually the UN, IOM, International Organization for Migration, or UNHCR, the UN Agency for Refugees. And here it's run by 2 different logics. The first is to increase efficiency, that these agencies may be more efficient about it, but also because of credible commitments, that perhaps those actors are more likely to implement the policy even when there aren't domestic pressures to not do it. And there's also a fourth area, which is unilateralism, like I said in the title. And that's when states do not agree on a common policy. And so they take their actions separately through their own international institutions, so their own national institutions. And we can talk about that more later. So I came up with and developed and tested this idea of necessary conditions for each type. So when you think about this, you can see high capacity and credible partners can lead to coordination. So when EU member states choose to coordinate migration policies with states that have high capacity to implement and are trusted to implement the policies that way the states are intended. Right? In contrast, an EU member state would choose to collaborate with a state that has low capacity, and there are credible partners to support joint implementation on the ground, right? You have to know that someone's there that you can trust to work with, even if they don't have the capacity. If a state has low capacity and no credible partners, they'll subcontract to international organizations. So individually, the conditions are necessary but not sufficient to lead to the subcontracting, but a combination of them is sufficient to leading to subcontracting. And finally, if the state has high capacity and is not a credible partner, there's no cooperation, and that state would unilaterally act and implement its own policy on its own, regardless of the EU. They're going it alone. So in this discussion today, you can think of Italy in the coordination sector, you can think of Poland in the collaboration sector, and Greece in the subcontracting sector. And we're going to look at that more closely in the next bit. So in Greece, they experienced several decades of migration crises and economic crises. The EU tried to intervene when policies failed and crises continued. It was clear that Greece still had low state capacity and were not credible partners. So when the most recent crisis hit, the EU delegated or subcontracted to international organizations. There were three phases in the most recent Greece migration governance. We can think of the first phase as real chaos in Greece migration institutions. From 2011 to 2004, the EU intervened in very strategic and targeted ways. And in the most recent period, 2014 and 2017, they subcontracted to international organizations. In the first period, there was real chaos in Greek institutions. Asylum seekers were only allowed to apply in one police station in Athens. The Human Rights Watch reported that thousands of people would show up at a police station each Saturday, and Greek officials would walk down the line and pick 300 people to be interviewed that week. In 2010, there were only 900 beds in the country for vulnerable refugees, which left many homeless or sleeping on the streets. The asylum backlog actually amounted to 19,000 cases, but then went up to 52,000 cases by 2012. During this first phase, you can see the Greek government failed to provide any meaningful protection. During the second phase, we see a pattern of EU interventions. So in response to those policy failures from before, the EU shifted its approach to collaboration, right? Joint implementation of policies. The EU created two new agencies to intervene. That's Frontex, the border agency, and the European Asylum Support Office. Frontex is the EU border agency that does joint missions with border guards from around Europe, doing things like checking passports or patrolling the land and sea borders in Greece. The EASO, this is the European Asylum Support Office. It's now actually renamed the EU Agency for Asylum. It also does joint implementation with asylum officers from other countries to assist with paperwork and to help with clearing the backlog of cases. In total, 175 officers from 26 different member states were sent to Greece during this period. But after 4 years and nearly 10 million euros, the EU's approach for collaboration through the EU agencies just didn't work. The Greek asylum system still only had 1,000 beds and a backlog of 37,000 cases. So there's a clear lack of state capacity, and the Greek government overall was not credible partners. In my book, and I can't spend much time on it today, you can see there's discussion of why both parties and both coalitions weren't partners, but there's a real tension here that both, even though they're on different sides, center right and center left, both agencies were resisting implementing EU policies domestically, in part because of the Dublin system. The Dublin system, of course, is the idea that when a migrant or asylum seeker crosses into the EU for the first time, they should apply for their asylum in that country that they apply for. And then if they go somewhere else, they'll get sent back to that first country that they entered. Well, in Greece, from 2011, there was a court case at the European Court of Human Rights that suspended all transfers back to Greece because the standards of the Greek asylum system were so low. Well, this disincentivized Greece from ever implementing the policies, and we can see how that plays out in the next phase. So in the third phase was really subcontracting to international organizations. Like I said, 73% of the emergency funds from the EU went to international organizations. The UNHCR led in camps and aid delivery, and relocations in Italy to the rest of Europe were led by International Organization for Migration. So much of the response was, the majority of the response was led by international organizations. And this is that second period. As you can see, the scale of the third phase is almost off the charts, right? It's 13 times higher than the first two phases put together. Here, this chart, I zoomed in a little bit. You can see it's the most recent crisis. It shows the arrivals for C by each month in Greece. The EU responded to this large influx in several ways. The first was in May 2015 to create this new hotspot approach where Frontex and the EU asylum agencies were put together in one space, and they're supposed to process arrivals on different Greek islands. In some ways it worked. In other ways, it created these closed detention centers that created a deadlock for refugees to move on from the islands. In September 2015, the EU created this new emergency relocation mechanism, which I've mentioned before. The target was to relocate 160,000 refugees from Italy and Greece to other EU member states to just share the burden. But this program was a failure. Only 33,000 people were relocated from Greece and Italy, which is only 21% of the target, right? So it only reached that small number and didn't really shift the burden to anyone else. In March 20th, 2016, the EU signed the EU-Turkey deal, which gave 3 billion euros in exchange for effectively stopping all new arrivals to Greece from Turkey. But Greece was still left with 60,000 refugees who were stuck in Greece because the northern border of Macedonia was closed off. So the fourth way the EU responded was through this emergency funding. And I really focus on this in my book and explaining why it was such a subcontracted process. For the first time, the EU used humanitarian aid inside the EU for an EU member state. The money had previously been intended for aid outside of the EU. The first three interventions, hotspots, relocation, and the EU-Turkey deal, are forms of collaboration because the EU member states decide together how they're going to do something through the council, and then they work together to implement this through agencies. Here, the fourth, though, emergency funding, is a classic example of subcontracting because it empowers an external international organization to implement the work in member states. This graph shows that 73% of the emergency funding went to international organizations and only 23% went to Greek governments. So theoretically, as in all of the EU, Greek government, the member states should be leading the response and coordinating humanitarian actors. But in practice, on the ground, the Greek government had few staff, and in part that was because of austerity cuts that the EU forced on the Greek government because of the financial crisis. So here's a quote from one of my interviewees from the European Commission. For the time being, the Greek government are not there yet. In the meantime, we're encouraging them to put all the structures in place to make sure that they use the EU funding. But for efficiency's purpose, it's better to use this kind of financial agreement, right? Here, again, the efficiency logic is going on with the Commission. The military set up all of the camps, but didn't manage the aid inside of the camps. When I interviewed one Navy commander who in charge of a camp in Athens, he said, I only put up a fence and make sure everyone is safe. I don't know what's going on inside. Instead, the camps were coordinated by UNHCR or an NGO. And here's a map of 34 camps, refugee camps in Greece in 2016. During my fieldwork, I acquired this list of camps on the left, which was circulated around by the government, which was attempting to appoint an NGO to be in charge of each camp. But some of those NGOs had never been consulted and didn't actually have the resources or experience to coordinate a camp. UNHCR ended up being the largest recipient of emergency funding for the EU and was the sort of provider of last resort. This included having something called a delegation agreement from the EU, which was 80 million euros to set up a national coordination scheme and increase the number of beds for refugees. Here you can see a flow chart I got from my time in Greece. Also, you see it's all channeled through the UNHCR. Most of the time when UNHCR set up a working group or a field level coordination mechanism, the government was supposed to be there to help coordinate, but never actually showed up. This is a picture from the field in which UNHCR often ran coordination meetings with all NGOs and actors on site. But these meetings became very contentious as volunteers actually began blaming the UN for the abysmal response. Many of these meetings, as I said, were supposed to be chaired by the government, but as is common in Greece, the government officials just never show up. So while on paper, the Greek government officially coordinated the response. The majority of the funding and many of the actual deliverables, like the number of beds, rotations, camp management, were implemented by international organizations. By 2017, UNHCR had 511 staff in country, while the Greek Asylum Service had only 451 employees, and the EU Asylum Agency had only 172. Right? We can see that in Greece, the combination of low state capacity and no credible partners led to the EU subcontracting their response to the international organizations. Now, let's look at Italy. Okay? From 2014 and to 2017, again, 600,000 people crossed the Mediterranean. In previous periods, in the earlier phase, there were lots of bilateral agreements about this, mostly between Italy and Libya. You can think of one in 1999 or 2000, putting something like 5 billion euros towards investments and cooperation in migration, forcing Libya to invest in their land border or build migration detention centers, to criminalize trafficking and having joint patrols over the Libyan border. Actually, Berlusconi said they wanted more oil and less migrants. Right? This is sort of an early precursor to the EU-Turkey deal. But social media often had pictures of this going around recently, actually, suggesting that there were Syrians invading Italy. In fact, it's actually Albanians arriving in Italy in 1991. This was during the first phase when irregular migrants came mostly from southern Europe and the wars in the Balkans. Despite Italians being mostly sympathetic to Albanians, the government deported them back to their country. So if we move back to the second phase, I call this the Lampedusa model, because the asylum seekers often were received on Lampedusa, that's the island in the little corner here off the coast of Libya, and then were distributed around the country for housing. During this phase, the government expanded its state capacity. First, it established 20 new asylum commissions in each region. UNHCR is a voting member on each of those commissions. I call that collaboration, not delegation, because they're deciding with the EU or with the member state. Second, there were 11 new identification and expulsion centers. Right? This is increasing the capacity of the state to decide what to do with these asylum seekers. And third, they created 161 SPRAR, which are a type of housing for refugees around Italy. This was a significant increase in Italian government's capacity to process and house asylum seekers. This expansion of capacity happened when the number of asylum seekers was actually fairly low, below 40,000 each year. So we turn to the third phase, which is 2011-2013. After the Arab Spring and the fall of Gaddafi in Libya, 50,000 people arrived by boat in just 1 month. The government declared a national emergency and responded with an emergency plan to expand reception facilities, have a fair distribution to regions based on their population size, and guarantee assistance to all refugees. Italy also issued temporary residency permits, and most migrants actually traveled north to other EU states, forming a sort of de facto sharing of the burden. At the end of 2013, the government closed most of the camps and gave each migrant 500 euros to repatriate, but we know most of them didn't leave. Now, again, thinking about credible partners, the book goes into it a lot more, but on both sides, the center left and the center right, we see that they, despite being sometimes pro-EU or anti-EU, both sides are actually in favor of greater EU solidarity for migration policies, including things like regularization and increasing the state capacity and having new forms of regulations of migration, sometimes more restrictive, but it is always an increase of the migration state capacity. Now, of course, it was different in Italy than Greece. In Italy, it was only 170,000 for this short period versus 800,000 people in Greece. But the influx in Italy during this time was 5 times larger than the North African emergency, that period before. Because of the necessary conditions of a high state capacity and a credible partner of the EU that had been built up from previous crises, the EU responded through the Italian-led coordination of the response, and they funneled the aid through Italian institutions expanding the previous Italian systems of reception and asylum instead of delegating or subcontracting to the UN. Now, 90%, 99.4% to be exact, of the aid went to the Italian government and not to EU institutions. I spoke to a UNHCR official who told me Italy has a totally different capacity. It has a long history of having every year this movement of people, and they have the capacity to cope with the regular flow of around 150,000 people a year. In Greece, we are deeply involved. We're actually doing things. So in this fourth phase, the Italian government responded by launching a wider search and rescue operation. They expanded the administrative capacity to process asylum claims. They went from having 20 to 40 asylum commissions. They increased their number of staff from 168 staff to 250 by the end. The number of asylum decisions made each year went up by 70%. And they opened 16 new identification centers and 26 new specialized asylum courts. And they opened 877 SPRAR. Right? In 2014, 35,000 people were housed in emergency centers, but that number grew to 70,000 by the end of 2015, a real increase in capacity. In summary, in Italy, the history of migration crises help show that state capacity and trust with the EU that happened when there were recent crises hit, that they had high state capacity and credible partners that led to coordination. In contrast, we can see that Greece had low state capacity and didn't respond to previous crises by building that up, and no credible partners that when this most recent crisis happened, the EU subcontracted most of the response to UN agencies. Now, I want to turn to that second point that I was discussing about how these crises and repeated policy failures actually help to Europeanize different parts of migration policy. Through these repeated crises, migration governance gradually moved from informal coordination in different meetings that were on the side of different councils to formalized coordination within the council, to more formalized collaboration with actual joint projects and agencies sharing pots of money and staff, and sometimes subcontracting to international organizations. Policy failures provided information to the EU and other states about the level of capacity and credible partners in each country. And you can see here on border security side, you can see different coordination mechanisms that after they failed or had sort of fumbles and were sort of stressed during crises, they were upgraded often to a form of collaboration. We can see, just looking at the numbers, the number of staff at the EU level within the European Asylum Support Office grew from 61 in 2012 to, I think it says 235, right? Huge amount of growth. And then similarly, the Frontex budget, this is the border agency, grew from 19.1 million euros in their budget in 2006 to 301 million in 2007, and more now. Staff was 72 to now 655. The end result today is that there's more migration state capacity at the EU level than ever before, right? Despite the primary responders continuing to be member states. So the EU's latest attempt at new legislation was the new Pact on Migration and Asylum. It was proposed in 2020, and it proposed that in cases of mass influx, member states could choose to participate either through relocations, i.e. the quota, similar to what we did before, or sponsor returns, right, i.e. deportations. If pledges fell short, the European Commission could request states to cover their fair share, but not force. The pact has stalled out because of disagreements in the council between member states, and who think it's not fair that some states host refugees while others simply pay for deportations. And it's unlikely that the negotiations will start anytime soon, considering the pressures and politics of the current Ukrainian crisis. So let's now turn to the Ukrainian crisis. The EU response to the Ukrainian crisis was to actually activate the the Temporary Protection Directive in March 2002. That was a little less than a year ago, very quickly activating the Temporary Protection Directive, which was passed actually in 2001, which allowed all member states to let the migrants in and provide temporary protection without having to go through the asylum process. It was a way to provide this protection. It actually was designated to remove the pressure off of the few member states that would be near the external borders and allow everyone to do it. But actually, it had never been activated before, and Italy and Malta had requested to activate it in 2016, but it wasn't activated. So we see a real difference there. The activation allows for the freedom of movement in the EU. It also allows Ukrainians to apply for the right to work, education, housing, and healthcare. But it's not a form of asylum, right? If temporary protection status were to be removed, they would have to apply for asylum still. By just today, 8 million people have crossed the EU, and 5 million of them technically applied for temporary protection status. So there's sort of wiggle room in that area. I want to ask, why is there a different response now for Ukrainians rather than in 2022 than the asylum seekers who came in 2015? The first reason I have to say is discrimination, right? The EU generously opened its borders to white Christian Ukrainians, but refused equal protection to Syrians, Afghans, and other non-white asylum seekers, right, who have a similar claim to protection. Journalists and politicians were not shy in hiding their bias, right, when they welcomed Ukrainians because of their, quote, relatively civilized or relatively European, or they used justifications about their cultural or religious similarities. Okay? A second reason is geopolitics. The EU, the same EU member states, Poland, Hungary, and Slovakia, that blocked temporary protection directive in 2015 are the ones that needed it today. The EU Dublin system required asylum seekers to apply in the first country where they enter, which, if it was kept in place in 2015, as it was in 2015, would mean that today, Poland, Hungary, Slovakia would be the ones responsible for these 8 million Ukrainian applications for asylum, and to be responsible for offering housing and education aid. These countries opposed unified EU migration policies back in 2015 when they were not directly affected, but then flipped when Ukrainians started arriving in their train stations. The third area that can explain this is, again, my findings about state capacity and political will. In the case of Poland, they had a relatively lower state capacity, but the political will to collaborate with EU on implementation. Poland wants the EU agencies at the border and the money for implementation. The temporary protection allows actually a burden sharing to spread more equally around member states without setting up a formal relocation mechanism as they did in 2015. And instead, Ukrainians can redistribute themselves to the member states with more capacity or more openness. It's not clear how long the temporary protection will last. Actually, it's only legislated for 1 or 2 years. Each member state could honor that commitment or change in the near future. However, we have seen that there is a further Europeanization of migration governance here. First, they activated TPD, right, the Temporary Protection Directive, for the first time using an EU-wide response. And second, they're relying heavily on Frontex and the European Union Asylum Agency during this crisis to coordinate best policies and things at the border. It is not the case that the EU decides and implements all things related to migration, right? It's not within their competency to do that. But we've seen more formal coordination in EU forums, more funding as a form of solidarity with the border states, and greater capacity at the EU level. So, in conclusion, let's return to my research question at the beginning. Why does the EU respond differently to migration crises in different member states? First, implementation was determined by state capacity and political will. States coordinated when capacity was high and there are credible partners, but when capacity is low and there are no trusted partners, they subcontract. But this sort of delegating a responsibility is really a short-term fix to a long-term problem. Second, policy failures led to greater Europeanization of migration governance. The EU first tried to coordinate migration policies, but when it failed, or when a partner was revealed to not be credible, the EU tried to collaborate instead. This process moved further down to different types of coordination or collaboration, and through iterative negotiations of policy failures, it led to more and more collaboration. Policy failures provided that information to the EU and other member states about the level of capacity that these partners in each country had, so they could devise and negotiate a better strategy. And the third finding I think is important to say is that EU migration governance in general is rife with contradictions and is a playground for geopolitics and clearly blatant racism, as is seen as the difference between the EU response in 2015 and 2022. I'm going to leave it there. I look forward to our discussion. We can talk more about either the current events or how this applies to some of the current policies. I leave on the screen here my book, Delegating Responsibility, International Cooperation on Migration in European Union. It's actually open access, so you can download the PDF at this link. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Nicholas. Thank you for these insights and for the examples. I would like to invite the audience to pose questions. You have the opportunity to do that through a box that is below your screen, and it says Q&A. Please do so. But I have already one question regarding the Europeanization. So, as I understood, in Greece is an example and a model that you show as a place where the Europeanization accelerated and entered, so to speak, new phase at the non-presence actually of the state. Now, to my knowledge, it was fairly similar situation in March last year in Poland. So do you see what are the parallels and what are the similarities or differences, if you could localize this notion of Europeanization in these different contexts?
Yeah. So again, I haven't done fieldwork in Poland, and I'm looking forward to seeing the presentation in a couple of weeks to hear about the comparison of the Polish border and the Belarus border, which I think will be excellent. In terms of Europeanization in the specifics, right? Greece can be a very interesting case because it happened at a moment of crisis. We'll also see if this moment of crisis in 2022 is a moment for further Europeanization. I think we can see some of those proposals put forward either through the pact or through the mobilization of the agencies as that, right? In terms of deployment, we see Frontex and EASO being quite active at the border and Polish authorities being quite active, right? It wasn't UNHCR being the main responder to it, and they weren't coordinating all of the refugee centers. We saw the Polish state providing many of that with EU funding. Right. Now, there was a huge voluntary response, as there was in Greece. Actually, I think that's one of the sort of, I don't know if it was unsung, but there's an important story to be told in Greece and Italy about the NGOs and the civil society actors who provided a lot of support in places where the EU and the national governments didn't want them to provide them the support. For example, just last couple of weeks, one of the a person who was leading a search and rescue operation in a Greek island was put on trial in Greece, accused of human trafficking. Of course, most human rights lawyers say that that's ridiculous and he was helping, but this is a sign that the Greek government is trying to prevent civil society from filling a space where they weren't willing to provide the aid. I think that might be something to watch in the future. Maybe not Poland, but Hungary or others could do a similar space to prevent even the support of Ukrainians. Public opinion right now is quite favorable towards that, but it changes very quickly, as we see in other cases of migration crises. Do you want to circle back about Europeanization? I can answer another question if you have another way you want to talk about it or want to think about it.
Hang on, we have a question from the audience. Was the racism that caused the different responses to the migration coming from people of the country itself, or was this racism exhibited more by the government itself?
That's a great question. I think it has to be put on both sides, right? In terms of like formal legal structure, the racism and discrimination is stark, right? It's very clearly that one was treated differently than others. The call for legitimate, what is legitimate the form of persecution or fleeing violence in Ukraine, the type of violence that was being used towards civilians is the same as what was happening in Syria and Afghanistan. Right? Empirically the same. Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International have reports documenting all of this, even though the EU agencies don't want to acknowledge that. On the other side, public support, we can see that there are examples of blatant racism in society against Syrians and Afghans during that period. Although there were opening of doors and a friendly welcome at the beginning of the crisis, it mostly comes months or years later, and a similar sort of civil society welcoming of Ukrainians. So I think it has to be said that it was on both sides. And in fact, oftentimes political scientists say that the politicians or leaders feel empowered to make discriminatory or racist comments because they know that the public may share those beliefs or express those beliefs, right? So they're reciprocal.
Yeah, I guess it's also difficult to differentiate, between these two levels, and they are probably very much interconnected. I have another question, and please pose your questions. Circling back to the Europeanization. So from the critical borders perspective, the mechanisms that you described in Greece, so subcontracting and outsourcing the state power to non-stately actors, is a way also to dilute the responsibility and to dilute the responsibility. Do you think this is also a model for Europeanization in other fields or other places?
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely a process of diluting responsibility. The amount of loopholes and freedom of information requests I went through to try to get access to these delegation agreements was extensive. I kept going months and months. It almost took 9 months to get just the UNHCR delegation agreement from them. It is a way of putting a barrier in between holding government officials accountable or the EU accountable and hiding it into these other agencies. Of course, subcontracting to businesses and like G4S is about having getting things more efficient, right? Efficient means costing less, providing less food, less space, putting more migrants into this thing, speeding things up, meaning that they're not having much time in between their detention and their deportation, which means they're not getting necessarily the full appeals. These are all like efficiency also means invasion of their human rights. So I completely agree with that. In terms of it as a strategy in the future, absolutely this, right? My next book project is with Kelsey Norman. She's at Rice University. And we're looking at the way that the EU turned externally with their funding to delegate responsibility to other states outside of the EU, right? So this is a form of externalizing the EU migration policy to, Turkey was the first example, then North Africa, and pushing it even further. So our new study looks at the EU Emergency Trust Fund for Africa, which put 6 billion euros into trying to get African countries to prevent migrants from coming. Right? It's explicitly as part of their remit is to address the root causes of migration to prevent them from migrating. And that subcontracting doesn't actually go mostly to states. It goes often to development agencies or to other actors on the ground, NGOs or UNHCR, sometimes private consultancy agencies. It's another layer of responsibility which can't be held accountable and is harder to trace, frankly, very hard to trace. It's a whole nother book project.
I wonder, also how much this fuels populism, the feeling that the state is not taking the responsibility. We have a question from Mari Rauktis, and she will go online. She will have the opportunity to post this question online.
Oh, thank
Mari,
you.
go ahead.
Hi. Actually, I didn't mean to raise my hand, but I'm glad I did. So I teach global perspectives in social work here at Pitt. And so in just thinking about what you presented today, which has been really fascinating, as we're, most of my students have much more of a domestic focus. And so much of my work is just sort of doing sort of the basics of, like what are the SDGs and, so anyway, long story short, I'm just wondering, I know you look at this with a different lens, but what's the role of social work in advocacy and policy in terms of particularly making this more transparent as responsibility gets shifted away from the state? I'm just wondering, is there a place for social work in this more, we tend to think of social work as a micro field, but I'm wondering if there's also a role for social workers in advocating at a macro level. Not very useful question, but it got me thinking as you were talking.
Social work is very much a part of this process. When young people, unaccompanied minors, arrive in the Greek islands or Italy or in Ukraine, now coming across in Poland, they often have to be identified as vulnerable before they get resources, right? This is a social worker who needs to do that. If an asylum officer isn't trained on we call it the best interest of the child, they won't be able to screen and provide the resources that are necessary for that, right? Now, getting access to the children, getting access to vulnerable people is difficult, right? If we look at the case in Greece, on the island of Lesbos, right? The most famous camp there is Mora. It burnt down a couple of years ago after being overcrowded. I mean, it was originally built, I think, for 3,000 people, ballooned to 12,000 people. During COVID, it was turned into a closed detention center where no one could leave. And it became a hotspot, actually one of the hotspots where Frontex and EASO were supposedly screening people for asylum applications. Well, that closed detention center then had, obviously lots of vulnerability, lots of opportunities and need for social work. But because it was a closed detention center, most of the NGOs or civil society workers couldn't get in, couldn't actually get information, couldn't provide that support, right? So there are these spaces of both state delegation, where they're subcontracting it to others, and then other spaces where the state completely shuts it off and tries to make it a closed center, right? Italy has the same type of centers as well. And so I think there's this real tension between the EU both providing human rights and access to asylum, right, which is fundamentally part of the EU project of rule of law and human rights, and also part of the project of security and securitization and Fortress Europe, right? Building up extreme security. And that tension is alive and well in all of these processes. And social workers will run into this in case by case, right? A child that they're literally just trying to get out of the camp and into some protection. We know that vulnerable children, if they don't have a lawyer, are something like 3 or 4 times less likely to get any sort of status, right? They fall through the gaps, and a social worker can help be the thing that gets them access to those sorts of processes. Thank you for that question.
And the other way around, the social working to prevent that too. Okay, I have 2 questions from the audience in the Q&A box, and I will just read them. Isn't it a bit of an overgeneralization to attribute the different EU response to the Ukraine crisis and the Greece crisis to racism? After all, Ukraine is Europe, and the situation there has much more dire consequences for the continent. Also, what is inherently wrong with accepting more Ukrainians, especially given their easier path to assimilation into other EU member states? I think racism is often overly used.
I think it's a fair point to say it's not just racism, right? There are lots of political reasons for them to for it to be different. Like I pointed out, discrimination, geopolitics, and state and political will. So it's not just that, but it is clearly part of it. And you can hear it because of those statements. We can see the speed and way in which the doors were opened, that it is clearly part of it. I was part of advocacy campaigns in 2015 and 16, trying to show that Syria and Afghanistan were clearly part of the security and like important agenda for the EU, right? The EU has clear interest in Syria and Afghanistan, right? So, and the people who are coming to the EU were already in the EU, right? They were in Greece and Italy already. So it's hard to make the case that it wasn't like they hadn't arrived yet, right? It's different to say that the EU should go to Afghanistan to help them, but these Afghans and Syrians were already in Greece and Italy. It's this question about cultural assimilation is also a hard one, right? We know that most asylum seekers and refugees can assimilate very quickly, given the right resources. And there are other problems for Ukrainians to assimilate, right? It's a little too easy to generalize that because they're Europeans or white or Christian, that they'll assimilate very easily, right? And it's probably too big of a generalization to say that Syrians and Afghans would not integrate.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So another question from Alan Howen Chang. If discrimination is a reality from governments trying to dilute their responsibilities, why can't the Inclusion and Diversity Code of Conduct also be regulated? ? Is it because of capitalism that still dominates how the regulations directives are drawn upon the EU tables? I hope it will be no more racism.
It's again a hard one, right? Many of these regulations, or if we think about where it falls in EU acquaintance, like the laws are not binding, they're not implemented directly into member states. The sort of inclusion criteria are not directly applied in this asylum sort of thing. The decision to make temporary protection directive to activate it was a political decision, right? And it happened in the council, and the commission had to decide to activate it, and the council has to approve it. And at that point, then member states have to do the implementation. They actually interpret it differently. So you can see different interpretations in France versus Germany versus Czech Republic. All of them have different interpretations, but they have to do something for it, right? But that's at the political level, not at this sort of inclusion thing. And one wants to hope that will be a one-to-one. People become more inclusive and not discriminatory at the individual level. But on the structural level, there's a clear door open for Ukrainians and a door closed for Syrians and Afghans, right? And that no policy guidance is going to change that.
Thank you. And then last question, and I guess this is going to be wrap-up question, a very general one too, I guess. Can you speak to why the temporary protection was triggered in 2022, but not 2015?
Yeah, I mean, I think the reason is, as I mentioned, it's discrimination, the geopolitics, and this state capacity. I think we can talk a little more about this geopolitics, actually. The idea that Hungary and Poland and Slovakia were against it, right? Against the quotas, against accepting refugees in these ways. In fact, one of the reasons you can directly connect it to racism is that Hungary and Slovakia said they wouldn't take any refugees who were being relocated from Italy and Greece who weren't Christian during the 2015. Right? So you see even there the racism and discrimination being encoded earlier on. Right? But that geopolitics flips, right? When the refugees or asylum seekers are coming into their country, right? And at that point, it's in their interest to activate TPD, and they do. Okay? There's actually an open question of why TBD wasn't activated in 2015. The letter was lost or something. There's this debate. My book has a little bit of a discussion of it. It's not clear how or why it was decided that it wouldn't be activated, or if there was a vote. We don't get like transcripts of the council meetings about this sort of thing. So behind closed doors, we don't know what those politics were, but somehow it was decided both Italy and Malta had requested it, and no decision was made and it wasn't activated. Right? So no decision means that it's a no. The activization in 2022, though, is very clearly at a moment where the EU wanted to show that it was providing support for Ukraine at a very big moment in the crisis, right? Early on, that they would be able to support people. And in fact, there's a self-interested moment there as well, that they didn't want to clog up asylum systems that were already struggling with other asylum seekers, right? You put 8 million people into the same asylum systems, it could really shut those down. Whereas the temporary protection directive allows them to just have a status almost automatically and apply through a different thing. So, like I said, discrimination, geopolitics, and still state capacity and political will, those are still part of this puzzle.
For me as an anthropologist, it was interesting how easily the discourse on victims was mobilized in the Ukraine case, whereas, these histories of war and, genocide and all that was completely wiped out in the case of other refugees. And that's very interesting too, as well. All right, Nicholas, I think we're out of time right now. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for this very interesting talk and insights into these various examples, and also into Europeanization and border control. Our next speaker will be Milada Vahudova next week from University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. The title of her talk is Ethnopopulism and Authoritarian Role in the European Union. These talks will be available online, first on our YouTube channel, then on our webpage. Please join us on that webpage, and please check the schedule for upcoming lectures. Nicholas, thank you again, and I hope to see you around. Keep in touch, and thank you for joining everyone.
Thank you so much. It was a real pleasure.
Thanks.